Hello, everyone. My name is Luba Vangelova. I'm the founder of the Hub, and I am here with Miró Siegel and Brooklyn Wetzel, our two wonderful co-facilitators of the Hub's Micro Academy. I can't say enough good things about them. But today will be, so we've already run a couple of, three info sessions in the past. They are available on our YouTube channel and here on Facebook, where we've gone over a lot of things about the Hub. But today we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into how Brooklyn and Miró encourage the participants in the Micro Academy to take ownership of their learning journeys. So without further ado, first, if one or both of you could summarize how is the Hub's Micro Academy different than what we would call, conventional education?
I can jump in. So what we do at the Micro Academy is very, to put it into one word, I would say it's very collaborative. So what our experience is completely co-created. So my role and the role of Brooklyn as facilitators, it's not to come in and commandeer our experience, but it is instead to open up the possibilities for all of the different things that all the participants are interested in. So we're holding space. And the other aspect of that, we're holding space, but the other really important part of that is the participants have to fill that space, right? So it becomes a very active, experience, and they take ownership over that through that. So I guess just kind of on a very conceptual level, that is essentially what really differentiates us. There's a lot of other details, of course, but on a philosophical level, I would say that's probably what it is.
And I would add that being that our participants are co-creators in the Hub Micro Academy experience, each term is different, dynamic, creative, depending on the participants and what they're interested in and how we all choose together to organize our time. Last year during the election, since the election and political processes were really, on people's minds, we created kind of a model government to determine different aspects of the activities that we are doing, videos that we might watch, and then we elected people to different positions to handle those decisions. And that was really fun to watch something in current events translating into a community project and part of our community governance. So that's just an example of how interaction and co-creation play out in the Micro Academy.
And so we think of the Micro Academy as interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary and without a fixed curriculum. So how does that manifest in, in more concrete terms? Like, how do you work with the younger participants? And I mean, I guess you're all really participants in a sense, and you're all co-creating it. But can you talk a little bit about your roles, how they differ from the roles of the younger participants, and how you kind of come together in those different roles to create an emergent curriculum?
Sure. I would say first and foremost, of course, the facilitators, as facilitators, we do always come prepared with certain things in mind, almost like to fall back on if participants maybe are looking for a little bit more guidance in that day, or they don't have an activity that they're, prepared to bring to the group. However, another part of that, the other side of that coin, is that we're always ready to defer to them, right? So let's say they do come to the group with an activity in mind that they're really excited about, that they want to share with the other participants, and they want to bring that social learning to the table. It's also part of our role to be ready to step down and give them that space as well, and to let them take ownership over the space. So it's always a big process of give and take. The same can be said for the activities that we do bring and that we end up, going into with the group, we also as facilitators have to be okay with the fact that sometimes the activities aren't going to be a hit, you know, and the participants aren't going to be as interested in them as we thought they would be. And that's not personal. We don't take it personally. And that, I would say that that's a really big, that's a big thing that both Brooklyn and I have had to learn over the course of working with the Micro Academy. But it's been a really great lesson, and just learning to let go and, you know, let the kids take the reins when they want to. And, you know, when they don't, we're here also to back up.
Mhm. Okay.
And you know, our goal as facilitators is to encourage curiosity and exploration of all of the information and like everything on the internet and outside of the internet. So we might have different, every participant, including us, has different things to offer a subject. And so we're there to ask questions and kind of share paths of for exploration with the participants so that they can have a well-rounded view of the world.
Absolutely. And if I could just jump in again also, like, you know, just to give some more concrete examples of what you just described, Brooklyn. Like, for example, I personally love history. So I always end up bringing things with a lot of historical slant to the group. But I know we've also got a really big focus on digital art in the group. A lot of the participants in our current group love digital art. We also do a lot of storytelling. We do a lot of, you know, fiction writing. So there's a lot of these different components that are being brought by everybody. And I think there's a certain beauty to kind of not breaking our time down into subjects. Because when we do that, I feel like it kind of makes it harder to realize that everything in the end is connected. And we have, like you said, this very interdisciplinary approach, but by not bringing it down to subjects, it better shows us like, yeah, how this web is totally connected between all the subjects. We could talk about history, and then we can suddenly realize, oh, well, this has a lot to do with, you know, mythology, with beliefs. This has a lot to do with, you know, like current political systems. So like we kind of can see how everything ends up being connected to each other. And I think that actually strengthens our understanding of these concepts as a whole. So I would very much argue that like kind of mixing all of these things together and not separating them really gives us a better understanding of them.
That's really interesting. Yeah, because I mean, a lot of us, you know, grew up with the idea that education is segmented into subjects. At least it is until you reach a certain age, and then you're done with your formal schooling, and then the rest of your life is not divided into subjects. So it's, you know, like, well, okay. And so can you perhaps think of an example where, you know, things segued naturally from one thing into another? And also, if you can explain then, you know, how do you prevent that from just kind of, you know, following one thing after another, but, you know, how do you kind of manage to bring it back around and tie it together, you know, so that you're not just randomly doing this and, you know, then randomly doing that and so on. Like, how do you tie it together? And can you think of an example?
I think that, you know, we say that we're kind of just exploring and all over the place, but we do have like organized activities, and that's kind of where that exploration ends up playing out into like where we set aside a specific time to explore something in a specific way. Like Miró, we have a half-hour history, which is an idea that Miró brought, but other participants have also added their half an hour history to our time together. And so in that, you know, we give somebody the stage, so to speak, to share about something that really interests them. And so that's part of like the presentation part of self-directed learning. I like to think about, you know, the cycles of self-directed learning, where first you set a goal, and then you plan what you're going to do, you know, and the participants, when you do a half-hour history, you have to, you know, I'm going to do a half-hour history. What am I going to do? Plan on how you're going to do it. execute that plan, and then listen to all of our feedback as part of a reflection. So that's a good example I can think of where an interest or various interests are played out in a concrete way.
And also in a way that, strengthens our soft skills, right? Like that, it adds to your, like, your, for example, that example specifically adds to like your public speaking. It adds to, your ability to lead a group, to gauge interest. There's all of these different skills that are like social skills that are very important that get fleshed out through activities like this. And on the other hand, not only just for the participant who is, presenting or leading that half-hour history, it also very much benefits those who are listening, because not only are they learning about something that they don't know about, that they're not very familiar with, but they're also practicing how to listen and how to be present and how to hold space for another person and to be respectful, right? And so like those are just some of the, maybe some of the unseen skills that are being flexed in activities kind of like that. But I think that they're just as important, if not more important, than the actual thing that's being talked about,
Okay. And yeah, and for anyone who would like to have more information about concretely how each day looks, I encourage you to look on the website under the program tab, or to listen to the previous information sessions that are posted on YouTube and on the Hub's channel. Which go into a lot more detail than we have time for today on that specific aspect. But if you could talk a little bit more about then, so what are, how do you balance different interests? I mean, you mentioned how everyone brings something of value to pretty much every discussion and so on. So how do you encourage, each participant to take ownership when they may have different interests? They may have some overlap, of course, in their interests with other people, but there may be some non-overlap. And the more people you introduce into a group, the trickier it can become. Can you just talk a little bit about how you manage, what I always refer to, the balance between the me and the we, and using things like breakout rooms or whatever other tools you have to do that?
Sure.
And decision making also.
Sure. So we have a couple of basically like set time slots, usually towards the beginning of the day or towards the very end of the day, that we use specifically for reflection or we use for planning. So we kind of have these designated moments where we're very intentional about like how we're going to be spending our time together and what that's going to look like exactly. And it's in those moments that we have these discussions. Usually, there's a lot of other tools we use. Like you said, we use breakout rooms. So if there is a split in the group and half the group is really interested in one thing, the other half is interested in another, we don't have to compromise all the time. We can always just explore two different avenues, right? Without taking away from the experience of another. So that's a really important tool that we've been using a lot. It's been really great. And yeah, I would also say another thing, we're very intentional about almost like the social atmosphere of the group. Like we do see it as a community, and it needs to be seen as a community if it's going to function. And what I mean when I say that is we're very intentional about almost like facilitating the relationships between all of the participants, not just between the facilitators and the participants, but between the participants themselves. And it makes it a lot easier and a much more smooth process to get to those like, consensus-based decisions when everybody's really friendly with each other, when everybody, has a relationship with one another, and bottom line, everybody has respect for one another. So not only is it like, it feels good to exist in that space, but it also, it makes the whole thing work. So I don't think we could really have it without that sense of social camaraderie.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And can you, have you come across any thorny decisions where there was, significant differences in opinion about, how to proceed? I mean, since this is an emergent thing, how, can you give some, you're nodding your head, so maybe just talk us through an example or two and how you worked through that, and also what was learned from the process.
I mean, when thinking of specific examples on that topic specifically, it's hard to come up with a couple. It's more just like every once in a while there is, of course, when you're in a group of 8 or 9 people or however large the group is, there are moments of disagreement of how to move forward when, especially when we're working on like a collaborative project or something like that. And I would say that, we come to a resolution and sometimes we can't. And then a part of that is like having that conversation of, well, what does it look like? What happens when we can't come to a resolution? And these conversations themselves also almost become like a bit of a spotlighted activity where it's like, okay, well, let's actually explore this as a group and what are the ramifications of what just happened? So we really like are intentional, and we'll just turn around and just shine the light right back on the situation and then use that as an opportunity to kind of propel ourselves forward and also to learn from it so we maybe don't make the same mistake again in the future. So I think that having that, like I said about the friendliness and just the relationship, having that enables us to explore some uncomfortable things sometimes, and just to actually learn from them, to instead use them to our benefit.
I was just thinking about a time last week where we hit a moment of chaos and some participants got overwhelmed. I was overwhelmed, and we had to take some time to tend our relationship and to tend to the community vibe. And we were, how are we going to handle this in the future? What's a way that we can communicate with each other when we're overwhelmed? So we were exploring emojis and picking like a fire emoji. And as like, if we're in a moment and it's just like whatever's happening is too much and you need like focus now on you and your needs, put that fire emoji up, and that's a tool we can use in this digital space to communicate with each other when it might be something difficult. So that was really helpful that day, and it's a tool that we continue to, we don't have those moments very often, but I think everyone feels better knowing that we've created a tool together to address those issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a really good point. I mean, in probably any group of humans, there's always going to be some, issues and challenges to overcome. And rather than just sweeping them under the rug, I mean, I think you're very intentional. As you mentioned, a lot of the ability to kind of work together and to help everyone, feel like a co-creator of the experience. A lot of that hinges on the quality of the relationships. And so, even if it means, like you said, taking a step back and, okay, we're going to, maybe pause continuing to look into whatever we were looking so that we can, as you put it, tend to the relationship. Are there any other ways that you can think of that you kind of tend to the culture and build those relationships that perhaps other people can also use as inspiration for things they can do?
I think another way that has been really helpful for us, especially recently, is through the use of roles, right? So we have a couple of roles that we use. One is called the space keeper, the other is called the timekeeper. We've had a number of different roles in the past, but these are just ones we've been using recently that the participants have been enjoying. And they essentially take responsibility over certain aspects of the group's meeting. So the timekeeper is responsible for keeping us on track, making sure that we're staying true to our schedule and that we're being good to our commitments. And the space keeper is making sure that everybody has the space to be heard and to speak. And this, these kind of sound like very, and these are things that also Brooklyn and I just already do as facilitators. But it's been really great to also, throw that over to the participants and say, hey, you're also responsible for, these aspects of our meeting, or you can be. And so, yeah, basically allowing the participants to, they themselves be able to like say, all right, well, I'm the space keeper and I've spoken. Let's have a moment of silence and then let's go to this person next, or that person. I see that they have their hand raised, or, and just like, yeah, using these roles has been really, really cool. And I think it's been helpful. I think it's also little by little, we're also just training up those soft skills, like realizing when another person wants to jump in, making sure that there's space for them. And I think we've seen an improvement in that already. Even when people aren't using those roles by name, people are already more aware of that. So I think, yeah, creating roles and elevating other participants, other members of your group, and giving them responsibility and trusting that they're going to do a good job. That's huge.
Mhm.
I agree, Mira. It's finding every way that, as long as they're willing, if someone is willing to step up into leadership, giving them that space is so important, and trusting them to accomplish their goals and to learn from their mistakes, and give them the space to do that is so important.
Mhm. Okay. And do you find sometimes, a need for more, that some participants perhaps desire or need more guidance and more kind of encouragement to, take ownership and to become, more active in the co-creation? And if so, how do you deal with that?
It's always a very fine line, right? And I mean, of course, as facilitators, we are always, prodding and we're pushing and trying to see what kind of reactions we can elicit. But at the same time, it's a fine line in that you also don't want to overdo it, and you don't want to create like a forceful interaction and say like, well, you should do this, or almost like coerce them, even socially, right? Because
That would break the trust.
absolutely. So it's always a bit of a fine line. And you know what? Of course, we're humans too. Sometimes you do push a little too far. And I think also we've been very willing to, admit to the group, like when we've made mistakes, and say like, I'm sorry, like I shouldn't have done that. Let's talk about this or whatever. So yeah, it is, most importantly, like Brooklyn said, it is about maintaining the trust. But I still want to see the participants, do well, and I want to see them, like stick to their goals that they've committed to. And so, we do prod, but with respect always.
Mhm. Okay. And in terms of just, we've talked about this before, but interests, how to account for the different interests in the group, and that perhaps there isn't maybe one single thing that, where they all overlap. How do you balance it so that, maybe someone's getting to pursue their main interests some of the time, but not the rest of the time, and yet still feel connected and active, even if it's not their main point of interest that's being pursued right then?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is our creative projects, and how, like, in those places it's always set up that someone can pick the way that they want to express themselves. So there's all different kinds of ways. You could make a recording, you could do like, audio recording, a video recording, a digital illustration, a story, fiction story, a nonfiction story. I mean, there's really endless amounts of ways to take it. And so we try to leave it as open as possible. And then we're always like offering up new ways that people can express themselves. So I kind of see the hub as having tons of opportunities and places for people to express themselves how they want to. And we're just here to say, yes, we want to see however you want to express yourself.
And then how do you, though I I would think, you know, that you see part of your role though, and you've mentioned this, prodding, pushing, you know, I mean, not in a mean way, of course, but more in a challenge, you know, encouraging people. I guess maybe the way I would think of it is encouraging people to go beyond their comfort zone, challenging them to grow, to develop. So how does that fit in with, you know, wanting someone to take ownership, but then seeing that they may need a little bit of kind of encouragement, inspiration, I don't know, challenging, you know, how do you balance that?
Very carefully, I guess. Um, yeah, it's kind of a process that's hard to put into words. It's almost a very intuitive process,
Mm,
right? You know, especially when you start to form a very personal relationship, like with the participants. You know, you see them twice a week. You're there with them for hours at a time, and you start to understand, like, you know, who they are and what it is that they're looking for and what their quirks are too. And so it's hard to give one kind of like blanket statement that applies for every participant, because every participant has a different need and has a different way that they react to things. And I think that it does become a very intuitive act on the part of facilitators to know who it is that they're talking to, and to, like, you know, do their best and just to connect with them on a human level, right?
When I was thinking
Yeah.
about, you know, our role as facilitators, I was thinking about the whole community and how the community actually inspires individual participants by other participants, including us, what we create and holding, you know, our commitments to each other, keeping our commitments, creating this, you know, that commitment to our community is kind of part of the pushing, but that's not, I wouldn't even call that, that's just part of like really being present. And that's something that's really important in the hub, is that we're all present. So we're just, our job as facilitators is to just check in and see if, are you present? Are you here? Are you accomplishing what you want to do? And I find that the participants are inspired by each other. And that's just an incredible thing to have that connection.
Right. And not only are they inspired by each other, but they're accountable to
Yeah,
each other,
that was another.
right? And so, yeah, I think we are very intentional about that too. Like, one of our mainstays in all of our collaborative projects is, you know, group brainstorming sessions where we give each other ideas for different paths that we could take. And, you know, it's up to us to take them and run with them or not. But, you know, I think that that is also another way that we're very intentional about keeping the whole group active, and, you know, thinking about each other and the needs of others.
mhm. Okay. And it might be worth pointing out that, I mean, it's also kind of in a meta sense, you're also evolving your processes as, you know, time passes and as new situations arise and so on. And for instance, if one of you want to mention, you know, the reason why, you know, we recently discussed about having monthly individual check-ins, and the value of that. Do one of you want to just kind of mention that?
Sure. Yeah, we were discussing also adding monthly one-on-ones, because we were also noticing that, you know, when you have participants that are maybe a little bit more withdrawn, or maybe are a little more quiet, I should say, just in their personality. Sometimes it's not always incredibly comfortable to, you know, speak up in front of the whole group and to, like, on a more meta level of, like, you know, what are my goals? What am I looking for? What's working? What isn't working? You know, and so we were talking about starting up, doing, you know, monthly one-on-ones with all the participants individually to check in on that deeper level. And yeah, just to kind of draw these things out, maybe in a more insulated space, because it's not quite like if you were in a physical space with a large group of kids or participants, where, you know, maybe when discussion breaks out, there's all these other side conversations and they're kind of like private or semi-private. In a Zoom room, the volume is equalized across the board. And so sometimes, you know, of course, like this digital medium, it does present its own challenges. And so we've been coming up with a lot of our own different processes to, to accommodate those things. And these one-on-one check-ins has been an idea that we have been discussing for that reason.
Okay. All right. So that actually brings up another question. I mean, that's something that I hadn't really thought about, but of course it makes total sense that the volume in a Zoom room is very different than how it would be in a physical space. And so you have to manage around that a bit differently. What would you say are any other like main differences in how you have to tailor your approach differently to account for this being in the digital realm?
You have to, my first word comes to mind is patience. I feel that computers, you know, are all about patience, either like in a hardware sense or like in the software sense, the live sense, that you just really have to be patient and calm through the storm of technical difficulties that can occur. So that was the first thing that comes to mind. And also in helping people, like, you know, helping the group navigate communication, and learn how to do that in the digital space. That's just a practice that we're doing all the time.
I just was chuckling a little bit about what Brooklyn said, because it feels like over Zoom, if you respond to frustration with, you know, like with tension or with like even more frustration, it's multiplicative. You know, it's only going to grow. You need to be very patient. You need to be very cool, and just to keep trying, you know, just be calm, but you need to do it. You can't let it just sit.
Interesting. And I guess I would guess also that it's maybe a little more work to try to read participants and what they really sometimes maybe are trying to express or are not expressing, but to kind of the body language reading is, I would think, more challenging.
And I just wanted to say that excuse me, go ahead, Miro.
I was going to say it is more challenging in some ways to kind of understand where every participant is coming at it from. But at the same time, it doesn't have to be that way, because there are so many other tools and ways that we can communicate using Zoom that aren't available to us in a physical space, right?
That's
so
true.
It just comes down to the intentionality, like how well do we use these tools? How, you know, mindful are we about these things? Like, you know, like Brooklyn brought up earlier, like the emoji thing, when everybody's feeling overwhelmed, you can throw that up there. You know, you can use that to, you know, raise your hand. You can use the chat bar down there to have side conversations that don't disrupt the rest of the class, you know, and explore certain things. You know, there's a lot of different things that you can do through Zoom. You can change up your video background, and maybe, you know, we'll all explore different themes and throw up different video backgrounds. And I can scroll through my list. I've got a ton, you know, that are based on things that we've talked about. So it just comes down to understanding the tools that you have available to you and just trying to use them to the best of your ability. And it's not going to be the same as being in person, but it'll be different. Not worse, but different.
Interesting. So I guess some of this, you mentioned mindset at one point, the mindset of the facilitators, and how you, I guess I would say, have to, I guess, approach it without a big ego and not feel invested in your, you know, whatever ideas you're putting forth. and how do you cultivate that? If especially, I think, you know, if people are trying to shift from the proverbial sage on a stage model to the guide by the side model, I think ego is often brought up as one of the biggest challenges to overcome, the whole kind of mindset.
Oh, I was just thinking about a recent situation where a participant brought an idea to make a choose your own adventure game. And I had it in my mind that this was going to fit in with another one of our creative projects. And so we got into breakout rooms so we could like kind of flesh out the idea. And I was like kind of set on that and kept trying to like get him to make a plan around integrating this choose your own adventure into the world building. But it became really obvious that that was not his idea at all. That was the idea that I had brought to the breakout room, right? And as soon as I realized that my ideas around making it a part of this other project was actually holding it back, and I wasn't listening because I had so much this other idea in my mind, and I let go of that and said, you just want to do this separate, right? And it was like, yes, now let's develop it along that line. And it was and it actually ended up being a better project for everyone. This is a little, you know, separate from this other thing that we're doing. It's good to have variety. So there's just an example of a moment where I kind of came to it thinking that I was supporting his goals, but I brought my own thing and I had to just put it away and let it go where it needed to.
And oh, go ahead, Mira.
I was just gonna say, yeah, I mean, we want the participants to meet their own goals, not the goals that we've laid out for them, right? Like that's the most important thing, because you know, we can, you know, I think self-actualization is the most important. I guess I could just leave it there. It's, you know, it's great to see someone meet their own goals and feel satisfied, and, you know, and just become a different person through that. So all the better.
Okay. And so that segues into the benefits of kind of having a more kind of co-creative, collaborative, you know, each person taking ownership approach. Can you just distill the benefits? I mean, it sounded like Brooklyn. I mean, one of them might be that it becomes more like rolling a rock downhill, you know, once you're kind of aligned with a participant rather than trying to push them in a certain direction, you know, which can be kind of like push, you know, action, reaction. But then it's more like, okay, we're both, you know, rolling down the hill. This is much, you know, less energy intensive, right?
Yeah, and we're all on the same team now. And now we're practicing being in community. We're practicing team building skills, meeting goals together, being in relationship with each other. So I think that those are really important deep skills and deep benefits to building an equalized relationship and co-creating our experience. That's one of the main ones.
Well, and learning also just flows so freely when there's no resistance, right? When there's no resistance to it. It's like, I am here because I want to be here, completely changes the energy and the dynamic that that person is going to bring to the group, rather than, you know, if you have somebody sitting in your Zoom call for a few hours because they feel like they have to be there, that's a completely different experience. And just trying to cultivate that, like, you know, that buy-in, you know, they want to be here because they want to be here. So.
Okay. All right. And so, and you get that buy-in because they feel that they're being listened to and they have an active role, right? I mean, is that what you would say creates the buy-in?
Absolutely. And it's fun.
Yeah.
And it's just a pleasurable experience to be there. So why wouldn't they want to be there?
And because there are not limits on what they can create and what they can explore, those doors being open creates for very welcoming space.
And so, so you actually, the way you experience it is, you know, people, the participants are excited and interested, engaged to be learning things. They're not having to be forced to learn things, right? I mean, that's certainly the impression I get.
Yep, that's what we do.
All right, and then so just to perhaps conclude, what are, you know, what would you say are the biggest takeaways from your experience of having done this now for almost 3 terms? What do you think either other professional educators who are trying to develop more of a facilitator type of role, or perhaps parents with their own children, especially when there are multiple children, you know, with different interests and so on. What are some of the main things that people can put into practice and start building on to go in this direction?
The one thing that I would say has really colored my, my view of this whole thing has been the realization of participants. All right, so yes, participants, when they come and there's a social dynamic and there's a lot of learning happening on a ton of different topics, some that they might not necessarily be interested in exactly, but they're being exposed to, that's really valuable too. But the biggest realization is that participants in an environment like this get out of it what they put into it. And so it changes my perspective, or it changed my perspective a lot. And I started to think about like, okay, so now the question becomes, how do I get them to engage and how do I get them to invest, right? Because that's what they're going to be getting out of it.
Mhm.
So that was a really big realization, just this idea that kind of like the differentiation between education and learning, right? Education being a passive process, something that is done to you, whereas learning is an active process and something that we do for ourselves.
Mm.
And kind of trying to think about it within those frames or within that reference has been a huge perspective shift and like game changer for me.
What I was thinking about, I saw a facilitator ask a similar question around a group of youth that were interested in creative writing, and they immediately went to a specific curriculum with a set of things to do. And my best advice in that, if someone is interested in something, to open up, like to have a prompt, but to open up the possibilities of that prompt to be many things. Right. So the idea could be like, I'm interested in creative writing. And instead of picking a way to do that, like we're going to learn poetry, then we're going to do a short story, then we're going to learn what a biography is. Instead, just what do you feel like creating? And to open up the possibilities for how youth can express themselves and follow their lead.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Miro, just to kind of dig just a little bit further into what you said, you know, how you said the question becomes how to get the participants to engage and to invest. So what would be like one method, one of your kind of maybe tried and true at this point methods that you've seen really work in that regard?
Well, Brooklyn just touched on it actually, and that's meeting the participants where they're excited, right? So just kind of probing that, feeling like, all right, well, what is it that you really like about this idea? Let's talk about it. Let's understand it. And then let's crack open that door and say like, here's a bunch of ideas and potential projects that you could do. If you're interested in one of them, run with it. And we're here to support you in that. So just meeting the participants where they already have that excitement and that creativity and that drive, is huge, because the truth of it is, kids are interested in, they're just interested. They have passion. You just have to discover and find it and then run with it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. And can you just give us a little sneak peek of how that's manifesting in this term without giving too much away, given that the presentation is not happening until mid-December at the end of the term, but just a little sneak peek and maybe if you want to allude to, the previous terms and just kind of the an example of how the passions have been helped to manifest.
Sure. I think I will take you up on that and go back a term.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
but I remember we had a really big collaborative project, and we created this base for everybody to jump off of, and they took it in a bunch of different directions. And I remember one of our participants, most of the participants were interested in creating, you know, either stories, or they were interested in doing something along the lines of creative writing when it came to our project. But one participant was very interested in coding and using like online software to make basic games. And so what they ended up running with was creating a side scroller platformer game over the course of a few weeks. They created some of the assets for it, and they like did some of the basic coding, and they created a couple of levels, and they showed it to us, and we had a chance to actually play it. The rest of the participants were able to play the game and to, you know, give it a shot. So that was one example, and we knew that this participant was very interested in, you know, coding and this, you know, this field. And so we encouraged it. We said, like, if you're able to do it, and if you want to try and push yourself and hone that skill, let's go for it.
And it fit in with everything else. It was
absolutely
a piece of kind of a larger creative project.
Yep. And it had the creative elements of what everybody had put into it. That was the base for, or the inspiration for this game.
In the world building,
mm-hmm.
Like a whole kind of fictional world, you know, that had been created with different, many different dimensions to it that would take too long to go into now. But anyway, Brooklyn, do you have something you would like to also?
Oh, I was thinking about just some short activities. We do some collaborative drawing activities, and we have a participant that's really interested in the Blender 3D modeling program. So when we do those collaborative drawing things, some people are drawing on paper, some people are using a digital program. He's in Blender making 3-dimensional models of the prompt. And I've seen that inspire other participants to get interested in 3D modeling themselves. So it's really neat to see that kind of cross-pollinating interests in learning.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, the cross-pollination and basically what is that expression? The whole being greater than the sum of the parts, or, you know, by different people coming together with the different interests. You can look at it as kind of a challenge and a liability, because it's like, okay, now this person has this interest, this person has this interest, this person has this interest. How do I cater to all of them? Or you can look at it as an opportunity, and hey, they're now cross-pollinating, all sorts of, you know, kind of new things can arise out of that, and how do we build on it together?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I would also say, like, you know, truthfully, I'm learning a lot too myself, you know, because some of these topics I'm not super knowledgeable about. I don't know very much about 3D modeling, but alongside all the participants, I'm able to also undertake this learning journey, and like, it's been amazing. So I can only imagine that, you know, I hope that the participants have that same experience, that same outlook. So yeah, it's been amazing.
Actually, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you know, the more enjoyable it is for the facilitators also, you know, the more that, you know, it just magnifies everything, right? I mean, if you're also able to learn things, you know, it's not just a one-way street, and then you're also modeling how to learn, right? Because a lot of things that are coming up are perhaps new to you, you know? So it's, all right, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. Hopefully that's been useful to other people to take away some of these learnings, as they say in marketing speak, or in the corporate world, whatever. And any other parting words, or would you say that you've covered what you wanted to say?
I think we've covered most of what we had on our, but again, going back to, in just one word, have patience. That's my, like, the big parting word that I can end with.
Embrace joy. Embrace the joy of learning.
Yes, that is great. Great parting words. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Hopefully, like I said, it's been useful and other people can use this to help the people in their lives to also help take ownership of their learning. And thank you. And we'll probably be doing some more behind the scenes sessions like this in the future. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.